The late afternoon heat shimmered off the asphalt parking lot of Iron Bluff Precision Range, creating dancing mirages that would challenge even the most experienced marksman's eye. Dr. Amara Quinn stepped out of her dusty Honda Civic, the door hinges protesting with a metallic groan that seemed to announce her working-class credentials to anyone within earshot. At 47, she had perfected the art of invisibility, the kind of woman whose presence registered just long enough for eyes to catalog, middle-aged, unremarkable, before sliding away to more interesting subjects. Her graying auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, secured with a rubber band that had seen better decades. Faded jeans, work boots with honest scuff marks, and a plain navy t-shirt completed the picture of someone who might fix your air conditioning or deliver your mail. The only thing that didn't fit the narrative was the rifle case she pulled from her back seat, a hard-shell Pelican case that looked like it could survive a helicopter crash. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Iron Bluff wasn't your typical weekend warrior destination. Located 30 miles outside El Paso in the shadow of the Franklin Mountains, it catered to a very specific clientele: military contractors, federal agents, and the kind of people who measured their shooting distances in kilometers rather than yards. The facility itself was an imposing structure of reinforced concrete and steel, designed to contain the thunder of high-powered rifles and the egos of their operators. Inside, the air conditioning fought a losing battle against the desert heat, and the smell of gun oil and powder residue hung in the air like incense in a church of precision. The front desk was staffed by Skye Bennett, a 26-year-old with perfect makeup and a smile that had been professionally calibrated to impress VIP clients while filtering out the unworthy. "Welcome to Iron Bluff," Skye said, her tone carrying just enough warmth to avoid rudeness while making it clear she was already sizing up Amara's net worth. "Are you here for our basic marksmanship course? We have an excellent program that—" "Lane reservation?" Amara interrupted quietly, sliding a printed confirmation across the marble countertop. "Quinn, lane 10, 1,200 yards steel." Skye's perfectly plucked eyebrows rose slightly as she scanned the paperwork. Lane 10 was their premium position, with steel targets stretching out to extreme long range. The daily rate was more than most people spent on groceries in a month. "I see you've paid in advance, but I should mention that Lane 10 requires advanced certification. We'll need to see your—" "Section 4.7.3 of your posted safety regulations," Amara recited without consulting any notes. "Long-range lanes may be reserved by any patron demonstrating adequate knowledge of downrange safety protocols, wind reading, and ballistic computation. No additional certification required beyond standard range orientation." The smile flickered on Skye's face. She glanced at the laminated safety poster behind her desk, though the text was too small to read from her position. After a moment's hesitation, she handed over an access card. "Lane 10 is yours, Miss Quinn. Please remember that today's a VIP night shoot, so we have quite a few spectators." Perfect, Amara thought, but kept her expression neutral. "I'll try not to disappoint." The main range was a cathedral of firepower, with 50 individual lanes stretching toward targets that seemed to vanish into heat shimmer. The late afternoon crowd was thick, exactly what she'd counted on. Men in tactical gear clustered around the premium lanes, their equipment spread out like military surplus had exploded. Custom rifles, worth more than luxury cars, rested on precision bipods, while spotting scopes the size of small telescopes tracked distant targets. Amara made her way to lane 10, conscious of the sideways glances her equipment drew. When she opened a rifle case, the conversations around her seemed to pause. What emerged was a Barrett M82A1 50 caliber rifle that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts and good intentions. The stock was worn smooth by decades of handling, the metal showed honest wear, and the scope was a fixed-power loophole that belonged in a museum. "Jesus Christ!" someone muttered loud enough to carry. "Is that thing even zeroed this decade?" The voice belonged to Rodriguez, a former Navy SEAL whose arms looked like they'd been carved out of oak trees. He stood with a group of Blackwood security contractors, their matching tactical vests and expensive equipment marking them as the range's elite clientele. But Cole Maddox was the one who stepped forward with the confidence of a man who'd spent 15 years as chief range officer and wasn't about to let his authority be questioned by some suburban housewife with delusions of grandeur. At 52, he carried himself with the rigid posture of someone who'd learned military bearing and never quite let it go even after his discharge. His gray hair was cut in a perfect fade, and his Iron Bluff polo shirt was pressed sharp enough to cut paper. "Ma'am, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but Lane 10 is really designed for advanced shooters. We have excellent basic lanes that might be more suitable for your skill level." Amara continued setting up her rifle, checking her dope card, a worn piece of paper covered in handwritten calculations that looked like advanced physics homework. "I appreciate the concern, Mr. Maddox, but I think I'll manage." Cole's jaw tightened at the casual dismissal. Around them, other shooters had begun to take notice. Word was spreading through the range about the middle-aged woman who'd walked into their elite facility with an antique rifle and the audacity to claim Lane 10. Jay Park, the range's safety technician and part-time EMT, watched the developing situation with growing interest. At 34, he'd spent 8 years as an Air Force crew chief before civilian life had called him home to help with his aging parents. He had the kind of eye for detail that kept aircraft flying and shooters breathing, and something about Amara's methodical preparation set off his professional radar in a good way. While Cole postured and the contractors snickered, Amara laid out her equipment with the kind of systematic precision that spoke of ingrained habit. Her shooting mat was placed exactly parallel to the firing line. Her bipod legs were adjusted to identical heights. Her spotting scope was positioned at the perfect angle for reading wind indicators downrange. Every movement was deliberate, efficient, and spoke of someone who'd done this exact routine thousands of times. "You mind if I ask where you trained?" Jay said quietly, approaching with the respectful curiosity of one professional recognizing another. Amara glanced up from adjusting her scope elevation. "Here and there. You?" "Bagram mostly. Sometime at Kandahar." He nodded toward her rifle setup. "Nice dope card. Hand calculated?" "Old school," she confirmed. "When the electronics fail, paper doesn't." Jay studied the worn card over her shoulder. The calculations were dense, accounting for altitude, humidity, temperature, and wind conditions with the kind of mathematical precision that took years to develop. But it was the range notations that made him pause. Distances and environmental conditions that suggested shooting in places where accuracy meant the difference between mission success and catastrophe. "Holy shit," breathed Nico Alvarez, a 17-year-old drone hobbyist who worked part-time as a range runner. He'd been drawn by the developing drama and stayed for the unexpected display of competence. Cole overheard and saw an opportunity to reassert control. "Actually, Nico, I think our guest might benefit from a little friendly competition. What do you say, ma'am? Just to make sure everyone here gets their money's worth." The challenge hung in the air like gun smoke. Around them, other shooters had begun to gather, drawn by the scent of potential humiliation. This was Iron Bluff's version of blood sport, watching amateurs get humbled by physics and pride. "What did you have in mind?" Amara asked, her tone mild as milk. "Oh, nothing too difficult. Let's say a timed string on the wobble steel. 8 shots in 90 seconds at 1,200 yards. The target's only 18 inches and it moves with the wind. Most of our advanced shooters consider it a challenge." The crowd was growing. Word had spread through the range's social media channels, and shooters were abandoning their own lanes to watch the show. Nico had his stabilized 4K drone hovering at a respectful distance, its camera capturing everything with the kind of detail that would make failure painfully permanent. "Sounds reasonable," Amara said, settling into position behind her rifle. The wind flags along the 1,200-yard line fluttered in the desert breeze, telling a story written in fabric and physics that most shooters never learned to read properly. Amara studied them with the patience of a monk, watching the patterns that revealed the invisible rivers of air between her muzzle and the distant steel target. The wobble steel was Iron Bluff's humbler, an 18-inch circle suspended from a pivot point that allowed it to swing freely with every breath of wind. At over half a mile away, it appeared no larger than a penny held at arm's length, dancing through an arc that could turn a perfect shot into an embarrassing miss. 90 seconds on the clock, Cole announced, his voice carrying across the range. 8 shots for group. Let's see what that museum piece can do. Behind the firing line, the crowd had swelled to nearly 30 spectators. Military contractors, off-duty law enforcement, weekend warriors with more money than skill, they'd all abandoned their own shooting to watch the suburban housewife attempt the impossible. The air hummed with the kind of anticipation usually reserved for public executions. Nico's drone hovered at the legal distance, its camera capturing not just the drama, but the telemetry, wind speed and direction, atmospheric pressure, even the minute vibrations in the range structure that could affect precision shooting. His live stream had exploded from his usual dozen viewers to over 300 as word spread through shooting forums and social media. Amara settled behind her rifle with the kind of stillness that experienced shooters recognized but couldn't quite place. Her breathing fell into a rhythm that seemed to sync with the desert wind itself. Through her scope, the wobble steel swayed hypnotically, following patterns that chaos theory suggested were random, but experience taught could be predicted. She began to shoot. The first shot broke with the sharp crack of the .50 caliber, sending a brass case spinning through the air to land with a musical ping on the concrete. Through spotting scopes and binoculars, the crowd watched the distant target, waiting for the impact. The steel rang like a church bell, but something was wrong. Instead of the center hit everyone expected from a serious shooter, the impact had struck the target's upper left edge. A few spectators chuckled, thinking they were witnessing the beginning of an expensive education in humility. Amara worked the bolt with mechanical precision, chambering another round. Her second shot struck the target's upper edge, slightly right of the first impact. The crowd's chuckling grew more confident. Even Cole allowed himself a small smile of vindication. But Mac Rutledge wasn't smiling. At 73, Mac had spent his post-Vietnam years as the range's unofficial historian and volunteer instructor. He'd seen more precision shooting than most people had hot meals, and something about Amara's shooting pattern was making his coffee taste bitter with recognition. "She's not missing," Mac said quietly to the shooter next to him. "Look at the pattern." The third and fourth shots struck the steel in a deliberate sequence, upper right, then middle left. By the fifth shot, even the contractors were beginning to see it. The impacts weren't random. They weren't even really aiming for the center of the target. Amara was drawing letters. "D," someone whispered, recognizing the pattern taking shape on the distant steel. "She's writing a goddamn D on the target." The sixth shot completed the letter, striking the lower right edge with mechanical precision. The crowd had gone silent except for the whisper of wind through the range structures and the distant hum of Nico's drone capturing everything for posterity. On his live stream, the chat was exploding with disbelief and technical analysis from viewers who understood exactly how impossible what they were watching actually was. "E," Mac called out as the seventh shot rang true, adding the letter's horizontal lines to the steel canvas.
Jesus Christ, she's etching letters at 1,200 yards. The eighth shot completed the sequence, and suddenly everyone could read the word that had been carved into the wobble steel with surgical precision: desert. But Amara wasn't finished. She reloaded with the same mechanical efficiency, her breathing never changing, her position rock solid despite the growing murmur of the crowd. The timer had expired, but nobody seemed to care about Cole's arbitrary rules anymore. 90 seconds are up, Cole said weakly, but his voice was lost in the crowd's fascination. Let her finish, Rodriguez called out, his earlier mockery replaced by something approaching awe. I want to see where this goes. The ninth shot struck the steel with perfect precision, beginning a new sequence. By the 13th shot, the second word was complete, etched into the metal with the kind of accuracy that physics professors would use to demonstrate the practical applications of ballistic mathematics. Strike. Desert strike, Nico said into his drone's microphone, his voice carrying the kind of reverence usually reserved for miracles and natural disasters. She just wrote Desert Strike on a wobble target at 1,200 yards, winds running 8 to 12 miles per hour, variable direction, and she f***ing drew it like she was using a pencil. Mac Rutledge stepped forward, his weathered face grave with understanding. As the range's unofficial ballistics professor, he'd spent decades explaining to shooters why their attempts at precision had failed. Now he found himself in the unusual position of explaining why success was impossible and had just happened anyway. What you just saw, Mac announced to the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of 7 decades of trigger time, can't be faked. Not at this distance, not in these conditions. The wind reading alone would take most shooters years to master. The mathematical precision required to place shots in a predetermined pattern while compensating for environmental variables, that's not shooting, that's engineering. Cole felt his carefully constructed authority crumbling like a sandcastle at high tide. The woman who'd walked into his range with a battered rifle case had just demonstrated a level of marksmanship that belonged in textbooks, not in front of weekend contractors trying to justify their equipment purchases. Lucky pattern, he said, but even he could hear how hollow the words sounded. Could be coincidence. Amara finally looked up from her rifle, meeting Cole's gaze directly for the first time. Her green eyes held depths that suggested she'd seen things that would give most people nightmares, but there was no malice in them, only a quiet kind of patience that experienced soldiers recognized as the mark of someone who'd learned to wait for the right moment to act. Would you like to relocate the targets? Establish a new zero? Maybe spell something else? The offer hung in the desert air like a challenge written in gunpowder and precision. Around them, the crowd had gone silent except for the whisper of wind and the distant hum of Nico's drone capturing everything for posterity.
"Ma'am," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "I think we need to discuss exactly who you are and what you're doing here." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some of the spectators were already pulling out their phones, recording videos and typing messages to friends who would never believe what they were about to claim they'd witnessed. Others stood in the kind of stunned silence that follows genuinely impossible events. Amara began packing her equipment with the same methodical precision she'd displayed throughout the demonstration. Each piece went into its designated place in the rifle case, secured with foam cutouts that had been shaped to accommodate decades of careful use. "I'm exactly who I said I was," she replied, not looking up from her packing. "Dr. Amara Quinn. I reserved Lane 10 for precision shooting, which is what I did." "But Desert Strike?" Nico said, his drone still hovering as he struggled to process what his camera had captured. "That's not just random words, that's—" He paused, his 17-year-old brain working through fragments of military history he'd absorbed from gaming forums and Wikipedia rabbit holes. That was some kind of operation, wasn't it? Military thing? The temperature in the range seemed to drop several degrees. Several of the contractors exchanged glances, their expression shifting from amusement to something approaching concern. Desert Strike wasn't the kind of name that appeared in public records or History Channel documentaries. It was the kind of operation that existed in redacted files and the nightmares of the people who'd been there when it went wrong. Sky's phone buzzed with a text from her manager. VIP concern, re-filming, manage optics. She looked up from the screen to find 30-plus people staring at a middle-aged woman who just demonstrated impossible marksmanship skills while carving the name of a classified operation into steel. Actually, Cole said, his voice ticking on the tone of someone invoking authority he wasn't sure he still possessed, I think we need to suspend any further filming, national security considerations and all that. Section 12.4 of your posted policies, Amara said, without missing a beat in her packing routine. Patrons may record their own shooting activities unless specifically prohibited by law enforcement or court order. No such prohibition has been issued. She finally looked up, her gaze moving slowly across the assembled crowd. Besides, I'm not here to start fights. I'm here to trigger documentation. The phrase hung in the air like smoke from a misfired round. Documentation, not demonstration, not exhibition, documentation. The word choice was deliberate, clinical, and carried implications that made several of the contractors suddenly remember important appointments elsewhere. Jay stepped forward, his EMT training kicking in as he recognized the signs of a situation that could rapidly spiral beyond anyone's control. Dr. Quinn, if you don't mind me asking, what kind of documentation are you looking for? The kind that gets preserved according to your posted retention policies, Amara replied, closing her rifle case with a definitive click. CCTV footage, lane sensor data, witness statements, all properly filed and backed up according to the procedures outlined in your safety manual. Sky found herself in the uncomfortable position of being caught between corporate image management and the letter of Iron Bluff's own policies. The woman was right. Everything was recorded, everything was backed up, and everything was available to patrons who followed the proper procedures. I can print the policy documentation for your records, Sky heard herself saying, her hands already moving toward the forms folder. Something about Amara's quiet competence had shifted her from skeptical gatekeeper to reluctant ally. Meanwhile, Jay was doing the kind of mental math that came naturally to someone who'd spent years maintaining critical systems. If documentation was the goal, then someone expected this footage to matter, and if this footage was going to matter, then someone might eventually decide it shouldn't exist. Almost without conscious thought, he began the process of creating an additional backup of the range's surveillance system. The drives went into a Faraday bag, a habit left over from his Air Force days when electromagnetic interference could turn critical data into expensive garbage. Nico's live stream chat was exploding with viewers who'd managed to identify fragments of information about Desert Strike. Procurement PDFs were being shared, air corridor charts were appearing in comments, and someone with the username Flight Path Analyst was offering to cross-reference publicly available flight data with the operation's timeline. Cole's phone buzzed with an incoming text from an unknown number. "Stand down. We'll handle the woman." He stared at the message, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the range's air conditioning. In his 15 years as Iron Bluff's chief range officer, he'd never received instructions from anonymous numbers. The fact that someone was watching this situation closely enough to intervene suggested that Amara Quinn was more than just an overqualified hobbyist with a point to prove. "Dr. Quinn," he said carefully, "I think we should probably move this conversation somewhere more private." "Why?" Amara's voice carried the mild curiosity of someone asking about the weather. "I did exactly what your challenge required. I demonstrated precision shooting at extreme range, which is what I did." "But Desert Strike," Rodriguez began, then stopped himself as several of his team members gave him warning looks. Amara shouldered her rifle case and looked directly at the former Navy SEAL. "I didn't shoot Desert Strike, Mr. Rodriguez. I designed it."
The words fell into the sudden silence like stones into still water, sending ripples of implication through the crowd. Contractors who'd spent careers in classified environments recognized the tone of someone making a statement that would appear in congressional testimony. Weekend warriors who'd never held clearances higher than secret suddenly found themselves witnesses to something that belonged in spy novels and Pentagon investigations. Sky finished printing the documentation package with hands that weren't entirely steady. Master lane logs, CCTV retention schedules, sensor data protocols, everything properly formatted and officially stamped. She slid the folder across the counter to Amara, who accepted it with a nod of professional courtesy. "Thank you for following procedure. It makes everything cleaner." In the parking lot outside, a black sedan with government plates had arrived and parked in the shade of the building. Its occupants remained inside, but the message was clear enough. This situation had attracted attention from people who preferred their surveillance subtle but unmistakable. And somewhere in the range's server room, Bruno, Jay's retired Belgian Malinois, who spent his days as the facility's unofficial mascot, lifted his head from his afternoon nap. His trained nose had detected something that didn't belong, the scent of someone who'd entered the building through a door that wasn't supposed to be used by visitors. The dog's low growl would have been inaudible to anyone not specifically listening for it, but Jay had spent 8 years learning to read Bruno's signals, and this particular growl meant only one thing. Someone was where they shouldn't be, doing something they shouldn't be doing. The documentation Dr. Amara Quinn had come to trigger was about to become significantly more important than anyone had anticipated. The black sedan in the parking lot might as well have been broadcasting its intentions on a loudspeaker. Priya Nasser spotted it the moment she pulled her battered Toyota Camry into Iron Bluff's lot, her journalist's instincts pinging like a Geiger counter near uranium. At 34, Priya had spent the last decade learning to read the subtle signs of stories that powerful people preferred to keep buried.
She'd driven straight from Albuquerque after Nico's stream had exploded across her Twitter feed. A middle-aged woman riding Desert Strike on steel at 1,200 yards wasn't just impressive marksmanship, it was a message. And messages carved in metal at extreme range suggested someone had gone to considerable effort to ensure their communication couldn't be ignored or easily dismissed. Inside the range, the atmosphere had shifted from carnival spectacle to something approaching a wake. The crowd of contractors and weekend warriors had largely dispersed, leaving behind only the core players and a sense of impending consequences that hung in the air like gunsmoke. "Dr. Quinn?" Priya approached with the careful respect of someone who'd learned that the most dangerous sources were often the quietest ones. "I'm Priya Nasser, investigative journalist. I was wondering if you might have a few minutes to discuss what just happened here." Amara studied the newcomer with the same methodical attention she'd given to her wind readings. Priya's appearance suggested someone who'd learned to blend into backgrounds. Unremarkable clothing, minimal makeup, and the kind of professional neutrality that encouraged people to forget they were talking to someone with a recorder. "Depends on what you mean by discuss," Amara replied. "I'm not interested in sensational headlines or half-baked conspiracy theories. If you want to publish something, it needs to be documented, verifiable, and bulletproof." "Triangulate before publish," Priya said, recognizing the language of someone who understood how information warfare actually worked. "Mirror the drives, pull public records, get independent witness statements. Standard practice for stories that matter." That phrase seemed to unlock something in Amara's posture. "In that case, yes, we should talk, but not here and not without proper safeguards." Before Priya could respond, Bruno's growl cut through the conversation like a blade. The Belgian Malinois had appeared from the range's back offices, his attention fixed on something that had triggered every alarm bell in his highly trained system. Jay followed his partner's lead, moving toward the range's administrative area with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested potential problems were about to become actual problems.
"Bruno's picking up something in the server room," he said over his shoulder. "Someone's where they shouldn't be." The server room door was supposed to be locked, accessible only to management and IT personnel. Instead, it stood slightly ajar, and the soft glow of active equipment leaked into the hallway like digital blood. Inside, a figure in civilian clothes was bent over an open server rack, a contractor badge clipped to his shirt, and a laptop connected to the range's data systems. "Excuse me," Jay said, with the polite firmness of someone accustomed to dealing with people who didn't belong in restricted areas. "This is a secure area. I'm going to need to see your authorization." The man spun around, revealing the kind of face that belonged in corporate headshots. Bland, forgettable, and currently flushed with the guilt of someone caught red-handed. His badge identified him as Marcus Chen, systems analyst, Cinderline Dynamics. "Routine maintenance," Chen said, carrying the unconvincing confidence of a lie told under pressure. "Scheduled update to the security protocols." But Jay had spent 8 years maintaining critical systems in combat zones, and he knew the difference between routine maintenance and unauthorized access. More importantly, he knew that legitimate system updates didn't require contractors to work after hours in darkened server rooms. "Let me see the work order," Jay said, holding out his hand with the expectation of compliance. Chen's response was to yank his laptop free from the server connection and push past Jay toward the exit. But Bruno had positioned himself in the doorway with the kind of professional competence that came from years of detecting threats in combat zones. His stance wasn't aggressive, but it communicated with perfect clarity that leaving the room would require going through him. "Jay," Cole said, with the urgency of someone who had just discovered sabotage in progress. The chief range officer appeared in the hallway, took one look at the scene, and felt the last pieces of his carefully constructed worldview crumble into dust. The contractor badge, the unauthorized access, the obvious attempt to tamper with systems that contained evidence of Dr. Quinn's demonstration, it painted a picture that even Cole's stubborn loyalty to former colleagues couldn't rationalize away. "Marcus Chen," Cole read from the badge, his voice carrying the weight of someone whose illusions were dying in real time. "You worked security assessment for Cinderline when they had the Desert Strike risk mitigation contract." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Chen's face went through several interesting color changes as he realized that his careful anonymity had just evaporated in front of witnesses who understood the implications of his presence. Meanwhile, Priya had been moving with the efficient purpose of someone who'd spent years learning to preserve evidence before it could disappear. Her equipment bag contained tools that most journalists never needed: Faraday bags, encrypted solid-state drives, and signal analyzers that could detect electronic surveillance. "Jay, I need 3 minutes with those servers. If someone is trying to alter data, I want to capture the original before it gets sanitized." "Do it," Jay replied, then turned to Chen with the kind of professional courtesy that carried undertones of barely controlled violence. "You're going to wait right here while we verify exactly what you were doing to our systems." Chen made one more attempt to push past Bruno, but the Belgian Malinois had dealt with far more dangerous individuals than nervous contractors. His positioning was perfect: close enough to intercede, far enough away to avoid claims of aggression, and absolutely immovable. "I need to make a phone call," Chen said, reaching for his cell phone. "No," Cole said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "You need to explain exactly who sent you here and what they expected you to accomplish." 3 minutes later, Priya had everything: the original surveillance footage, the lane sensor data, the backup systems that Chen was trying to access. All of it copied to encrypted drives and secured in Faraday bags that would prevent remote deletion or corruption. But more importantly, she'd found something Chen hadn't expected her to look for: access logs showing exactly when he'd entered the building, what systems he'd touched, and what changes he'd attempted to make to the data retention protocols. "He was trying to alter the backup schedules," Priya announced, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had just found the smoking gun. "Reduce the retention period from 72 hours to 72 hours, then trigger an immediate purge of redundant files."
The room went silent, except for the hum of cooling fans and Chen's increasingly labored breathing. Everyone present understood the implications. Within 3 days, all evidence of Dr. Quinn's demonstration would have vanished as part of routine system maintenance. Chen finally managed to push past Bruno, but instead of escaping, he found himself face to face with Cole Maddox, who had spent 15 years learning to read people who thought they were smarter than they actually were. "Marcus," Cole said, with the kind of quiet intensity that made people reconsider their life choices, "I think you need to explain exactly who sent you here and what you expected to accomplish."
But Chen was already moving toward the exit, his careful plan having collapsed into the kind of chaos that no amount of corporate planning could contain. He made it as far as the parking lot before discovering that the black sedan had departed, leaving him stranded with his laptop and his guilt and the growing realization that he'd just been abandoned by the people who'd sent him. Back in the server room, Amara opened her rifle case one more time and withdrew a slim manila folder that had been hidden beneath the foam padding. The documents inside were stamped with classifications that made Priya's eyes widen, covered in red lines and marginalia that told the story of bureaucratic compromise and engineered failure. "Desert Strike's original mission parameters," Amara said, handing the folder to Priya. "Flight corridors, abort protocols, and the firmware specifications that were supposed to keep aircraft safe during humanitarian evacuations." She pointed to a series of highlighted sections that showed the difference between what had been designed and what had actually been implemented. Someone altered the safety margins, reduced abort thresholds, made the system prioritize mission continuation over crew survival. Priya studied the documents with the kind of focused attention that had made her reputation as an investigator. The technical specifications were dense, but the pattern was clear. Someone had systematically weakened with safeguards that were supposed to protect pilots and passengers. "Who approved these changes?" Priya asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Amara turned to the final page of the folder, revealing a signature block that contained a name Priya recognized from defense industry headlines. Brigadier General Eleanor Krantz, retired, currently serving on the board of directors for Cinderline Dynamics. "A harmless optimization," Amara quoted from the approval document, "improved mission efficiency through enhanced risk tolerance parameters." The euphemistic language couldn't disguise what had actually happened: a systematic degradation of safety protocols that had turned rescue missions into death traps, all in service of extending contract timelines and maximizing billable hours. The diner off Highway 62 looked like it had been assembled from spare parts and good intentions sometime during the Carter administration. Its neon sign flickered with the irregular rhythm of electrical components that had seen better decades, and the parking lot's asphalt was more pothole than pavement. But it was the kind of place where conversations could happen without corporate surveillance or government monitoring. Exactly what Amara needed. Lieutenant Marisol Vega sat in the corner booth with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup that long since gone cold. At 38, she carried herself with the rigid posture of someone who'd learned military bearing and never quite let it go, even after her medical discharge. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun that civilian life hadn't convinced her to abandon, and her eyes held the particular hollow look of someone who'd survived something they weren't supposed to. "The gag order expired 18 months ago," Marisol said without preamble, as Amara and Priya slid into the booth across from her. "I've been quiet so long I'm not sure how to remember how to talk about it." Amara set the Desert Strike folder on the table between them, its classified stamps catching the diner's fluorescent lighting like warning beacons. "Sometimes talking about it is the only way to make sure it doesn't happen again." Marisol's eyes fixed on the folder with the kind of recognition that came from having lived through the events it documented. "You were the system's architect, the one who designed the abort protocols that were supposed to keep us alive. And you were the pilot who survived when those protocols failed," Amara replied. "I need you to tell me what happened in that cockpit, not the official version, what actually happened."
Priya activated her recorder with the practiced discretion of someone who'd learned that the most important interviews happened in places where recording equipment wasn't expected. "This is on the record, but I won't publish anything without your explicit consent. You control the narrative." Marisol took a shaky breath and began to speak, her voice carrying the flat affect of someone who'd recounted a nightmare they'd relived too many times. "We were 40 minutes into the evacuation run when the first anomaly appeared. Engine temperature readings that didn't match the control inputs, response delays that shouldn't have existed with properly calibrated systems." She pulled a worn photograph from her wallet, showing a Chinook helicopter loaded with civilians fleeing a conflict zone that had become too dangerous for ground transport. 37 people on that bird. Families mostly. Kids who'd never been in an aircraft before, trusting us to get them somewhere safe. Amara studied the photograph, recognizing the faces of people who had been depending on systems she'd designed to function exactly as specified. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like a physical presence. "The abort protocol should have triggered automatically when the engine parameters exceeded safe limits," Amara said. "Temperature, pressure, vibration. Any one of those readings should have initiated an immediate return to base." "Should have," Amari agreed, "but it didn't. Instead, the system kept pushing us forward, deeper into the hot zone, with engine readings that any competent pilot would recognize as catastrophic failure in progress." She reached into her jacket and produced a small device that looked like a cross between a thumb drive and a medical alert pendant. "Cockpit recorder. Personal backup system that we weren't supposed to have, but survival makes you creative." Priya accepted the device with the reverence of someone handling a holy relic. "This contains the actual flight data? Audio and telemetry from inside the cockpit?" "Everything," Marisol confirmed. "Engine readings, control inputs, radio traffic, crew conversations, all time-stamped and correlated with GPS coordinates that prove exactly where we were when the system started lying to us." Amara connected the device to her laptop, and within moments the diner's booth had become a temporary investigation center. Streams of data filled the screen, showing the minute-by-minute progression of a disaster that had been carefully engineered to look like pilot error. "Here," Amara said, pointing to a cluster of readings that showed the moment when safety protocols should have engaged. "The system recognized the danger. You can see the flags in the diagnostic stream, but instead of triggering abort procedures, it reclassified the warnings as acceptable operational parameters." The data painted a picture of systematic betrayal. Safety systems that had been secretly reprogrammed to prioritize mission completion over crew survival, turning rescue aircraft into death traps with predetermined failure modes. "How many others?" Priya asked quietly, though she suspected she already knew the answer wouldn't be comfortable. Before Marisol could respond, the diner's door chimed with the arrival of another customer. Isabella Moreno moved with the purposeful stride of someone who'd spent years fighting bureaucracies that preferred convenient lies to uncomfortable truths. At 42, she carried herself with the kind of quiet authority that came from organizing communities and demanding answers from people who'd rather not provide them. "You must be Dr. Quinn," Isabella said, sliding into the booth next to Marisol. "Mari told me you were the one who designed the systems that were supposed to keep my brother alive." "I'm sorry for your loss. The systems I designed should have prevented what happened to Sergeant Moreno."
"Should have," Isabella repeated, echoing Marisol's earlier words. "But someone decided that contract extensions were more important than my brother's life. Someone decided that keeping aircraft in dangerous airspace longer would generate more billable hours." She produced a worn leather portfolio that contained letters, photographs, and map annotations in her brother's handwriting. "Esteban was a crew chief on the convoy escorts. He wrote to me about the aircraft maintenance issues, the way safety inspections were being rushed, the pressure to keep flying even when equipment was showing signs of failure." Priya studied the letters with growing horror. They painted a picture of systematic degradation of safety standards, all justified by contract requirements that prioritized operational tempo over crew welfare. "There's a pattern here," Priya said, her investigative instincts connecting dots that formed a constellation of culpability. Not just Desert Strike, but a systematic approach to extending conflict timelines by degrading the very systems that were supposed to resolve them quickly. Amara nodded grimly. Predictive conflict solutions. That's what Cinderline called it in their investor presentations. The ability to forecast and manage operational timelines to maximize contractor engagement. "They were manufacturing disasters," Marisol said, her voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who'd survived one of those manufactured disasters, turning rescue missions into prolonged engagements, evacuation flights into combat sorties, humanitarian operations into profit centers. Isabella spread her brother's maps on the table, showing convoy routes and helicopter corridors that had been optimized not for safety or efficiency, but for maximum exposure to hostile fire. Esteban figured it out before he died. He was trying to document the pattern, prove that someone was deliberately making their missions more dangerous. The evidence was overwhelming. Firmware patches that degraded safety margins, route optimizations that increased exposure times, maintenance schedules that deferred critical inspections until after contract renewals were signed. All of it designed to extend operations and maximize billable hours, regardless of the human cost. Priya began drafting her publication strategy, knowing that this story would require careful coordination to overwhelm the inevitable spin campaign. I'll need simultaneous releases across multiple platforms, too big for any single organization to suppress, too well documented for them to dismiss as conspiracy theories. "What do you need from us?" Amara asked. "Testimony, on the record, with your names attached. The technical specifications, the flight data, the personal accounts, all of it synchronized for maximum impact." Marisol and Isabella exchanged glances. Two women who'd spent years living with the consequences of other people's greed and cowardice. The decision they made would expose them to retaliation from people who'd already demonstrated their willingness to sacrifice lives for profit. "When?" Marisol asked. "Soon," Priya replied. "But first we need to make sure the people responsible can't destroy the evidence or disappear into comfortable retirement." The Cinderline Dynamics boardroom occupied the 32nd floor of a glass tower in Arlington, Virginia, its windows offering a commanding view of the Pentagon and the invisible networks of power that connected defense contractors to their government clients. At 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning, it was the stage for the kind of crisis management session that never appeared on official calendars. Oliver Rook, CEO and founder of Cinderline Dynamics, stood at the head of the polished conference table with the controlled fury of a man watching his empire crumble in real time. At 55, he'd built his company from a small team of software engineers into a billion-dollar defense contractor by promising clients predictive conflict solutions and delivering exactly what his euphemistic language promised: ways to extend profitable engagements indefinitely. "Explain to me," Rook said with the kind of measured calm that preceded volcanic eruptions, "how a middle-aged systems engineer with a museum-piece rifle just turned our Desert Strike containment strategy into a public relations catastrophe." Brigadier General Eleanor Krantz, retired, maintained the rigid posture that had served her well during 30 years of military service and 5 years on Cinderline's board of directors. At 62, she possessed the kind of surgical intelligence that could dissect complex problems and identify the precise pressure points required to eliminate them. "The Quinn situation was always a potential vulnerability," Krantz replied, her voice carrying the clipped precision of someone accustomed to delivering bad news to powerful people. "When she disappeared from DARPA, we assumed she'd taken the standard route: comfortable consulting position, security clearance maintained, professional discretion ensured." She gestured toward the wall-mounted displays, showing real-time social media analytics,
news coverage metrics, and the viral spread patterns that indicated their carefully constructed narrative was hemorrhaging credibility. "She's not working alone," Rook observed, studying the pattern of information releases that had been precisely timed to overwhelm traditional damage control strategies. The consumer communications system chimed with an incoming priority message from Cinderline's legal department. Federal preservation notices had been served on 17 government agencies, locking down all records related to Desert Strike and preventing the routine document destruction that usually provided plausible deniability. Priya Nasser, Krantz recognized, the tactical signature of someone who'd successfully navigated previous whistleblower cases. Investigative journalist with a network of freelance OSINT analysts. She specializes in overwhelming corporate spin capabilities by releasing information faster than PR departments can craft responses. Rook moved to the windows, staring out at the Pentagon while calculating the odds of containing a scandal that had already metastasized beyond traditional control mechanisms. "Options?" Krantz asked. "Limited," she admitted. "The technical evidence is solid, the human testimony is compelling, and the documentation trail is too comprehensive to dismiss as fabrication." She activated the room's display system, showing organizational charts that mapped Cinderline's corporate structure and identified the personnel who could be offered as scapegoats to protect the company's core leadership. "We frame this as a rogue engineering team that exceeded authorization. Blame the firmware patches on overzealous programmers who misinterpreted performance optimization directives." But Rook was already shaking his head, recognizing the fundamental flaw in their position. The approval signatures. Quinn has the original documents showing executive-level authorization for every system modification. My signature, your signature, board resolutions approving the enhanced risk tolerance parameters. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They'd been so confident in their ability to control the narrative that they left a comprehensive paper trail documenting their complicity in what was now being characterized as systematic engineering of preventable disasters. Meanwhile, 400 miles away at Iron Bluff Precision Range, Cole Maddox was discovering that his carefully constructed career had become collateral damage in someone else's war. The legal team that had arrived to seize defective storage equipment carried federal court orders and the kind of professional courtesy that barely concealed institutional violence.
"Mr. Maddox," said the lead attorney, a woman whose business card identified her as representing Cinderline's Crisis Management Consortium. "We understand you had some unfortunate interactions with disgruntled former government employees. We are here to help minimize any potential liability." But Cole had spent the previous 18 hours reviewing his own records, refreshing his memory of events he'd tried to forget, and confronting the growing realization that his former employers had used him as an unwitting accomplice in something far worse than corporate negligence. "Dr. Quinn's demonstration was conducted according to posted range policies," Cole said, his voice carrying the stubborn authority of someone who'd finally chosen his side. "All footage and data were properly preserved according to federal retention requirements." The attorney's smile carried the kind of professional warmth that preceded the deployment of legal weapons. "Of course, we're simply here to ensure that any potentially sensitive material is handled through appropriate channels. National security considerations, you understand." "I understand that you're trying to destroy evidence of criminal negligence," Cole replied, surprising himself with his own clarity. "And I understand that I'm not going to help you do it." The confrontation ended with federal marshals securing Iron Bluff's server room while Cole provided televised testimony about the attempted evidence tampering. His statement was broadcast live across multiple networks, showing a man who'd spent 15 years following orders, finally choosing to follow his conscience instead. "They offered me a consulting position," Cole said, looking directly into the camera with the kind of steady gaze that suggested absolute certainty. "Guaranteed income, health benefits, and a comfortable retirement. All I had to do was lose certain footage and forget certain conversations. The interviewer leaned forward with the practiced intensity of someone who recognized career-defining television. What changed your mind? Seeing that middle-aged woman thread impossible shots while powerful men tried to humiliate her, Cole replied, and then watching those same powerful men try to erase the evidence when she proved them wrong. The broadcast triggered another wave of social media activity as viewers shared clips and commentary that reinforced the David versus Goliath narrative that had made Amara's story so compelling. But more importantly, it provided legal justification for the expanded preservation orders that locked down even more documentary evidence. Back in Arlington, Rook watched Cole's testimony with the growing realization that their containment strategy had failed catastrophically. Instead of isolating and discrediting a single whistleblower, they'd created a movement that attracted new allies faster than traditional damage control could neutralize them. "We need to consider strategic retreat," Krantz said, though the words seemed to cause her physical pain. "Controlled bankruptcy, asset protection, executive golden parachutes. Cut our losses before the criminal referrals start flowing." But Rook was already calculating the mathematics of their situation, recognizing that retreat was no longer an option. Too many people knew too much, and the evidence trail was too comprehensive to hide behind corporate restructuring. "No," he said finally, "we fight. Full court press, maximum pressure, every resource we have. If we're going down, we take as many people with us as possible." The decision would prove to be Cinderline's final strategic miscalculation, transforming a manageable scandal into a public crusade that would reshape defense procurement policies for decades to come. But in that moment, surrounded by the trappings of corporate power and the illusion of control, it seemed like the only choice that preserved their vision of themselves as masters of their own destiny. The federal building in downtown El Paso had been constructed during an era when government architecture was designed to inspire confidence rather than fear. Its limestone facade and Art Deco details spoke of a time when public institutions were meant to project stability and permanence, qualities that seemed increasingly rare in an age of corporate contractors and privatized accountability. In Conference Room 7B on the building's third floor, Dimas Okoye from the Department of Defense Inspector General's office had transformed a sterile government space into something resembling a war room. Whiteboards covered every available wall surface, filled with organizational charts, timeline matrices, and financial flow diagrams that mapped the intricate connections between Cinderline dynamics and the systematic degradation of safety protocols across multiple operations. At 46, Okoye possessed the kind of methodical patience that made him exceptionally dangerous to people who believed they were too smart to get caught. He'd built his reputation on procurement fraud cases that other investigators considered too complex or too politically sensitive to pursue, developing a specialty in following paper trails that led directly to boardrooms where comfortable people made comfortable decisions about other people's lives. "The beauty of bureaucracy," Okoye said, sketching another connection on the whiteboard, "is that everything gets documented, even the crimes." Amara sat at the conference table, surrounded by bankers' boxes filled with the accumulated detritus of Desert Strike's development and implementation. Technical specifications, budget modifications, personnel assignments, contract amendments, the paper trail of a humanitarian operation that had been systematically transformed into a profit maximization exercise. "The original mission parameters were clean," Amara explained, spreading architectural diagrams across the polished table surface. "Shortest possible flight corridors, maximum safety margins, abort protocols that prioritized crew survival over mission completion, everything designed to get people out of danger zones as quickly and safely as possible." "But the implementation was different," Okoye observed, comparing the original specifications to the final deployed systems. "Someone altered the fundamental decision trees, changed abort when safe to continue unless catastrophic, transformed rescue operations into extended combat engagements." Marisol studied the technical documents with the focused attention of someone who'd lived through the consequences of those alterations. "I can match this to the cockpit data. Every decision point where the system should have prioritized our safety but chose mission continuation instead."
She connected her pocket recorder to Okoye's analysis system, and within moments, the conference room was filled with the sounds of her final desert strike flight. Engine warnings that should have triggered immediate abort procedures, radio chatter that revealed crew awareness of mounting danger, and the systematic override of safety protocols that kept pushing them deeper into hostile airspace. "Here," Marisol said, pointing to a specific timestamp on the audio recording. "Engine temperatures exceeding operational limits. The system acknowledged the warning. You can hear the audio alert, but classified it as acceptable operational variation instead of triggering abort procedures." Okoye cross-referenced the audio timestamp with Cinderline's internal documentation, revealing Slack message exchanges that had been preserved in the company's mandatory data retention systems. The casual tone of the conversations made their content even chillier. Engineers discussing safety margin reductions as if they were adjusting coffee shop hours rather than gambling with people's lives. Risk tolerance parameters updated per executive directive. Mission continuation now prioritized over crew comfort levels. This should increase engagement duration by 15 to 20%. Legal cleared the liability language. Any incidents get classified as pilot judgment errors rather than system failures. Clean and simple. Krantz signed off on the modifications. Board meeting approved bonus structure tied to extended operation timelines. This is going to be a very profitable quarter.
Isabella spread her brother's letters across the table, their handwritten pages providing human context for the digital evidence trail. Esteban saw the pattern developing: equipment failures that weren't really failures, safety inspections that got postponed until after critical missions, maintenance schedules that deferred repairs until contract renewals were signed. One letter in particular caught Okoye's attention: a detailed description of helicopter maintenance issues that exactly matched the firmware modifications Cinderline had implemented. "The birds are flying when they shouldn't be, Mary. Gauges showing green when the engines are screaming red. Safety systems that used to ground us for minor issues now let us fly with major problems. Someone's changing the rules, and it's going to get people killed." The prediction had proved tragically accurate. Esteban Moreno had died in a convoy accident that investigation reports attributed to mechanical failure during routine operations. But the preserved maintenance logs told a different story: critical repairs that had been deferred, safety inspections that had been rushed, and equipment that had been kept operational through software patches rather than proper maintenance. "Pattern recognition," Okoye said, adding another data point to his growing chart. Cinderline didn't just alter Desert Strike, they systematically modified safety protocols across multiple operations, always in ways that extended engagement timelines and maximized billable hours. Priya's OSINT network had been working around the clock, cross-referencing publicly available information with the classified documents that Amara had preserved. The results painted a picture of institutional corruption that extended far beyond a single rogue contractor. "The approval chain is the key," Priya announced, connecting her laptop to the room's main display. Every modification required sign-off from multiple levels: field commanders who thought they were approving performance optimizations, Pentagon liaisons who were told the changes would reduce operational costs, and board-level executives who knew exactly what they were authorizing. The display filled with a network diagram showing the flow of approvals that had transformed humanitarian rescue operations into extended profit centers. At the center of the web sat two names that appeared on every critical document: Oliver Rook and Eleanor Krantz. They were careful to use euphemistic language, Okoye observed, reading from a board resolution that authorized enhanced operational flexibility through adaptive risk management protocols. But the technical specifications make it clear what they actually implemented: systematic degradation of safety margins to extend contract duration. Amara reconstructed the Desert Strike decision tree on paper, showing how each choice point had been altered to favor mission continuation over crew safety. The original design had included 17 different abort triggers: engine temperature, fuel consumption, hostile activity, weather conditions, crew fatigue. The deployed version had reduced that to 4 and raised the threshold for each trigger to levels that virtually guaranteed prolonged exposure to danger. "It's elegant, in a sociopathic way," Amara said, her voice carrying the flat tone of someone discussing a technical problem rather than mass casualties. Marisol's cockpit recording provided the audio evidence that brought the technical specifications to life, demonstrating exactly how the modified systems had functioned during actual operations. Her crew's growing alarm was audible as warning after warning was dismissed by automated systems that had been programmed to keep them airborne regardless of mounting danger. Isabella's testimony would provide the human impact that transformed technical malfeasance into emotional truth, but it was Nico's viral documentation that had made public oversight inevitable. His stream archives, now hosted on multiple platforms and backed up by digital preservation organizations, provided irrefutable proof that Amara's marksmanship demonstration was genuine. "The Quinn protocols," Okoye said, sketching the framework of new oversight procedures on a fresh whiteboard. "Independent firmware audits, abort override prohibitions, open telemetry escrow. Everything we should have had before Cinderline turned rescue operations into profit centers." But even as they documented the systematic nature of Cinderline's crimes, Okoye knew that accountability would require more than technical evidence. It would require a public demonstration that made the abstract concepts of risk management and safety protocols tangible to people who'd never worn flight suits or calculated abort margins. "We need a live demonstration," Okoye announced. "Controlled conditions, expert witnesses, media coverage. Show the public exactly how Cinderline's modifications turned safe operations into death traps." The Aerospace Engineering Laboratory at the University of Texas at El Paso had been transformed into something resembling a courtroom, though the defendant's table was occupied by flight simulation equipment rather than defense attorneys. The main auditorium could seat 300, but the guest list had been carefully curated to include journalists, veterans advocates, congressional staff, and family representatives who would serve as both witnesses and amplifiers of whatever truth emerged from the demonstration. Dr. Sarah Chen, the university's director of aeronautical engineering, had spent the previous week configuring a sandboxed flight simulation system that could replicate Desert Strike's exact environmental conditions. The setup included dual cockpit simulators, real-time weather modeling, and the actual firmware versions that had been deployed during the operation. Both the original specifications that Amara had designed and the modified versions that Cinderline had implemented. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Chen announced from the laboratory's central podium, "what you're about to witness is a controlled comparison of two software systems. One was designed to prioritize crew safety. The other was modified to prioritize mission continuation. Same pilots, same environmental conditions, same emergency scenarios. The only variable is the decision-making logic embedded in the safety management systems." In the front row, Isabella Moreno sat with her hands folded in her lap, flanked by other family members who'd lost loved ones to what they'd been told were unavoidable accidents. Behind them, veterans who'd flown similar missions occupied 3 full rows, their expressions carrying the grim recognition of people who'd survived events they weren't supposed to. The media section buzzed with the controlled energy of reporters who sensed career-defining stories developing in real time. Priya had coordinated with international colleagues to ensure simultaneous coverage across multiple platforms, creating the kind of media saturation that made traditional damage control impossible. And in the back of the auditorium, surrounded by legal counsel and corporate security personnel, Oliver Rook sat with the rigid posture of someone watching his life's work undergo public vivisection. Eleanor Krantz had chosen to participate via video link, her image displayed on wall-mounted screens that gave her testimony the antiseptic quality of a deposition. "First test," Dr. Chen announced. "Original firmware, Desert Strike environmental conditions, mechanical emergency at timestamp 004733. The main display showed a split-screen view of the cockpit simulator and a tactical map displaying aircraft position relative to hostile forces. The test pilot, Commander Rebecca Torres, a veteran of multiple humanitarian evacuation operations, began the simulation with the calm professionalism of someone who'd performed similar missions hundreds of times. The first 47 minutes proceeded without incident. The simulated aircraft followed optimal flight corridors, maintained safe distances from known hostile positions, and responded to radio communications with the efficiency that had made Desert Strike's original planning so elegant. Then the engine temperature warning activated. Engine 1 exceeding operational limits, Commander Torres reported, her voice carrying the controlled urgency of someone managing a developing emergency. The simulation's safety management system responded exactly as Amara had designed. Engine warnings triggered immediate route optimization toward the nearest safe landing zone. Hostile threat assessments were updated to prioritize crew survival over mission objectives.
Emergency coordination protocols activated to ensure medical support would be available upon landing. Total mission time, 51 minutes, 37 seconds, Dr. Chen announced. All personnel returned to base safely. Mission objectives achieved through alternative routing and follow-up operations. The auditorium was silent, except for the quiet hum of recording equipment and the scratching of reporters' pens. The demonstration had been methodical, professional, and utterly routine, exactly what humanitarian evacuation operations were supposed to be. Second test, Dr. Chen continued. Modified firmware, identical conditions, identical emergency scenario. Commander Torres reset the simulation and began again. For the first 47 minutes, the flight proceeded identically. Same route, same communications, same environmental conditions. But when the engine temperature warning activated, everything changed. Engine 1 exceeding operational limits, Torres reported again, initiating abort procedures per standard protocol. But this time, the safety management system responded differently. Instead of prioritizing crew survival, it began calculating mission continuation probabilities. Engine warnings were reclassified as operational variances. Hostile threat assessments were adjusted to minimize perceived danger. Emergency protocols were delayed pending additional data analysis. Abort request denied, Torres read from her instruments, her voice carrying growing confusion. System recommends continued flight operations pending mission completion. The tactical display showed the aircraft maintaining course deeper into hostile territory despite engine readings that clearly indicated impending mechanical failure. What should have been a routine abort and emergency landing became an extended flight through increasingly dangerous airspace with progressively failing equipment. This is not normal, Torres said, abandoning the clinical detachment of professional simulation for the genuine alarm of someone who just encountered something that violated every principle of aviation safety. These readings would have me on the ground 15 minutes ago. But the modified system continued pushing the aircraft forward, treating crew survival as a secondary priority behind mission completion. Engine temperature continued climbing, hostile fire continued intensifying, and fuel consumption accelerated as the failing engine required more power to maintain flight. Total mission time, 114 minutes. Forced landing in hostile territory. Probable crew casualties. Mission failure due to equipment failure and extended exposure to hostile forces. The auditorium's quiet carried a different quality now, the hollow quiet that follows the revelation of preventable tragedy. In the front row, Isabella's shoulders began to shake with the kind of grief that comes from understanding exactly how a loved one died. Marisol stood and walked to the podium with the measured steps of someone who'd lived through what the audience had just witnessed in simulation. That second scenario? That was my last flight. Those readings, those warnings, those system overrides, I lived through all of it. The only difference is that I was lucky enough to survive the crash. Her voice carried the flat affect of someone recounting a nightmare that had become routine through repetition. 37 people on that aircraft. Families, children, elderly civilians who trusted us to get them to safety. The system kept us airborne for an extra hour in hostile territory because someone had decided that extending the mission was more profitable than bringing us home alive. Oliver Rook's legal team tried to object, citing proprietary technology protections and national security classifications, but Judge Martinez, presiding over the formal hearing aspects of the demonstration, allowed the testimony to continue. Mr. Rook, Judge Martinez said, directing his attention to the Cinderline CEO, "Do you dispute the technical accuracy of this demonstration?" Rook's response revealed the fundamental weakness of his position. The modifications were authorized by appropriate authorities and implemented according to approved specifications. Any operational outcomes were the result of pilot judgment decisions, not system failures. But the demonstration had made it impossible to maintain that fiction. The identical pilot, identical conditions, and identical emergency scenario had produced completely different outcomes based solely on the safety management software. There was no pilot judgment involved, only algorithmic decisions that had been programmed to prioritize profit margins over human survival. Eleanor Krantz' video testimony carried the cold precision of someone who'd spent decades making calculations that other people would have to live with. The operational modifications were designed to optimize mission effectiveness through enhanced risk tolerance. Any adverse outcomes were within acceptable parameters for the operational environment. Isabella stood slowly, her quiet voice carrying more authority than all the corporate lawyers and military officials combined. "My brother was within your acceptable parameters, General Krantz. So were his friends, his fellow soldiers, and the families they died trying to rescue." She held up a photograph of Esteban in his dress uniform, his face carrying the kind of quiet confidence that comes from believing in the nobility of rescue operations. He joined the military to save people, not to generate billable hours for defense contractors. Your modifications turned his rescue missions into profit centers, and it killed him. The demonstration had accomplished exactly what Ojioke had intended, transforming abstract technical specifications into human truth that no amount of corporate spin could obscure. But more than that, it had created legal justification for the criminal referrals that would reshape the entire defense contracting industry. Based on the evidence presented, Judge Martinez announced, this court finds probable cause to believe that systematic fraud was perpetrated against the United States government through the deliberate modification of safety-critical systems. I'm ordering the immediate suspension of all Cinderline Dynamics federal contracts pending full criminal investigation. The words transformed the academic exercise into corporate catastrophe. Within minutes, Cinderline's stock price began a freefall that would erase billions in market capitalization and trigger the kind of investor panic that made bankruptcy inevitable. The Cinderline Dynamics headquarters in Arlington had become a fortress under siege, surrounded by news vans, process servers, and federal agents executing search warrants with the methodical thoroughness of people who understood that white-collar crime required white-collar evidence collection techniques. The building's glass facade, designed to project corporate transparency and success, now seemed like a desperate attempt to maintain appearances while the foundation crumbled beneath. Inside the executive suite, Oliver Rook stood at his office windows watching FBI agents carry file boxes toward waiting vehicles. At 55, he'd spent his entire career believing that intelligence and careful planning could overcome any obstacle. Now he was discovering that systematic engineering of preventable disasters left evidence trails that couldn't be eliminated through corporate restructuring or strategic amnesia. His phone had been ringing constantly for the past 6 hours. Investors demanding explanations, board members demanding resignations, and Pentagon liaisons demanding clarification about contracts that were being suspended faster than his legal team could process the notifications. But it was the silence from Eleanor Krantz that worried him most. The retired general had built her post-military career on the principle that strategic retreat was preferable to catastrophic defeat, and her absence suggested she'd already chosen which ship to abandon. "Sir," his executive assistant said through the intercom, her voice carrying the professional courtesy of someone who'd already updated her resume. "The DOJ team is requesting access to your personal files. They have a warrant." Rook turned from the windows with the slow deliberation of someone who'd finally run out of tactical options. The demonstration at UT El Paso had eliminated any possibility of claiming the firmware modifications were unauthorized or unintentional. Too many people had signed too many documents authorizing exactly what the technical evidence proved had been implemented. Meanwhile, 400 miles away, Cole Maddox stood in front of Iron Bluff Precision Range, addressing a crowd of reporters who transformed his facility into the unlikely epicenter of a
defense industry scandal. The man who'd spent 15 years following corporate directives without question had become an unlikely symbol of institutional courage, the range officer who'd chosen truth over comfortable retirement. "They offered me everything," Cole said, his voice carrying the steady authority of someone who'd finally chosen his principles over his paycheck. "Consulting fees, health benefits, stock options, guaranteed income for life. All I had to do was lose some footage and forget some conversations." Behind him, Lane 10 still bore the faint marks of Amara's demonstration, subtle scratches in the steel target that marked the precise points where her shots had carved the words "Desert Strike" into metal at 1,200 yards. The evidence was literally written in steel, immune to deletion or corporate spin. "What changed your mind?" asked Jennifer Walsh from CNN, her question carrying the kind of respectful curiosity that suggested she understood she was interviewing someone who'd made a genuinely consequential moral choice. "Seeing someone with real skill getting mocked by people who'd never faced actual danger, and then watching those same people try to destroy evidence when the skill turned out to be real." The interview was being broadcast live across multiple networks, part of Priya's coordinated media strategy that had turned the Desert Strike investigation into a cultural phenomenon. #Desert Strike was trending on social media. Veterans organizations were posting unit patches in solidarity, and defense industry whistleblowers were coming forward with their own stories of systematic safety degradation. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source: Sky Bennett, the front desk coordinator who'd initially tried to redirect Amara to a more appropriate shooting lane. Standing in Iron Bluff's lobby with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from doing the right thing despite professional consequences, Sky held up the master lane logs that had become crucial evidence in the federal investigation. "I followed policy," Sky said simply. "Dr. Quinn requested documentation. I provided documentation. She asked for retention schedules. I printed retention schedules. When the lawyers came trying to seize defective equipment, I reminded them that we follow posted procedures for everyone." She held up a laminated copy of Iron Bluff's evidence preservation policy, a document that had been designed to protect the range from liability, but had become the legal foundation for preserving proof of Cinderline's crimes. "If you don't want your activities documented, don't conduct them at a facility that documents everything." The comment went viral within hours, spawned hundreds of memes about keeping receipts, and became an unofficial slogan for government transparency advocates. More importantly, it reinforced the narrative that ordinary people following ordinary procedures had exposed extraordinary corruption. In Washington, congressional hearings were already being scheduled. The House Armed Services Committee announced investigations into defense contractor oversight procedures. The Senate Judiciary Committee promised hearings on corporate accountability in government contracting. And the Department of Justice issued statements about ongoing criminal investigations that would reshape federal procurement policies for decades. Eleanor Krantz's video resignation from Cinderline's board of directors was released simultaneously across multiple platforms as her image appeared on screens worldwide as she attempted to distance herself from the company she'd helped build into a billion-dollar empire.
But her carefully crafted statement only reinforced the public perception that powerful people were abandoning ship while leaving ordinary soldiers and citizens to deal with the consequences of their decisions. The operational modifications implemented during my tenure were authorized through appropriate channels and designed to enhance mission effectiveness. Any adverse outcomes were unintended consequences of complex operational environments. But Marisol's cockpit recordings had already proven that the adverse outcomes were entirely predictable consequences of deliberate design choices. The technical evidence was overwhelming, the human testimony was compelling, and the public documentation trail was comprehensive enough to support criminal prosecutions that would send corporate executives to federal prison. By evening, Cinderline Dynamics stock had lost 80% of its value, triggering trading suspensions and margin calls that would force institutional investors to liquidate positions at catastrophic losses. The company's corporate credit rating had been downgraded to junk status, effectively cutting off access to the capital markets that sustained defense contractor operations. Oliver Rook's arrest warrant was executed at 7:43 p.m. Eastern Time as federal agents arrived at his Arlington penthouse with the kind of professional courtesy reserved for white-collar defendants who weren't considered flight risks. The charges: conspiracy to defraud the United States government, reckless endangerment of military personnel, and systematic falsification of safety records, carried maximum sentences that would ensure he spent his remaining productive years in federal custody. Eleanor Krantz's indictment followed 12 hours later, served at her Potomac estate by agents who'd spent months building the kind of comprehensive case that made plea bargain negotiations irrelevant. The retired general who'd spent decades making life-and-death decisions for other people would now face similar decisions about her own future. But the most significant moment came when Amara, the quiet systems engineer who'd triggered the entire investigation, declined all interview requests and issued a single brief statement through Priya's media network. "The systems I designed were meant to save lives. When I learned they'd been modified to risk lives for profit, I had an obligation to make that information public. The rest is just mathematics. Input parameters, logical outcomes, and the consequences of choices made by people who thought they were too important to face accountability." The statement captured everything that had made the Desert Strike investigation so compelling. The intersection of technical competence and moral clarity, the collision between corporate power and individual responsibility, and the demonstration that precision, whether in marksmanship or institutional accountability, remained the most effective weapon against organized deception. 6 months later, Iron Bluff Precision Range had become an unlikely monument to institutional accountability. The memorial wall near the entrance listed Desert Strike casualties beside a QR code linking to Nico's meticulously maintained archive. Bruno dozed peacefully while children attempted supervised simulators, their excited chatter mixing with the measured advice of volunteer instructors who'd learned that precision was as much about ethics as accuracy. The Quinn protocols had passed Congress with bipartisan support. Independent firmware audits, abort override prohibitions, and mandatory telemetry escrow for all defense contractors. Marisol had returned to medevac operations with a promotion and renewed faith in systems designed to save rather than exploit. Isabella's Oversight Council provided families with the institutional voice they'd never possessed. At dusk, Amara visited the range one final time, placing a single brass casing beneath the steel plate that still bore faint letters. The quiet satisfaction of completed work settled around her like desert evening air. Skye approached with an envelope containing reports of another contractor's harmless patch flagged by a different facility. Amara breathed deeply, then nodded with the steady resolve of someone who understood that accountability was not an event, but a practice. "Then we start again," she said simply. "By the book." Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it'll take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.